I always believed I was close to God. For decades, I led my church with a firm hand, convinced that I was on the right path. My voice echoed through the temple. My words shaped lives, and my presence was strong, commanding respect and admiration. But what if everything I had lived, preached, and taught had been a terrible mistake? My name is Margaret Sterling, and that night, the service unfolded like any other. The pews were filled with eager faces. The choir's voices echoed beautifully through the halls, and I could feel the palpable energy in the air. There was something about it I cherished, the sense of command I held over the congregation, the respect and admiration that came with my role as pastor. As I ascended the pulpit, my eyes scanned the room, meeting the expectant gazes of those gathered before me. Each person, looking for guidance, for answers, trusting me to provide them. In that moment, I felt a deep certainty that I was exactly where I was meant to be, ready to offer the wisdom they sought. With a steadying breath, I opened the Bible on the altar and began to preach, confident in the words I was about to share. But something felt strange. For some reason, the words didn't flow as they usually did. They felt heavy on my tongue, as if something was stopping them. I ignored it and continued. My voice rose, and the faithful responded with enthusiastic amens. Then a sharp pain struck my chest. At first, it was just a minor discomfort, like a quick sting. I placed my hand over the spot and kept speaking. But then it came again, stronger this time. I blinked a few times, trying to ignore the tightness. The microphone trembled in my hand, but no one seemed to notice. The room around me began to blur, the sound of voices fading into a distant hum. I tried to take another step, but my legs failed me. The microphone slipped from my fingers, and then the ground rushed toward my face. A hard impact. The horror in the eyes of the congregation. The lights of the temple dimmed, the sound of screams and murmurs began to fade, and for a brief moment, time seemed to stop. The last thing I heard was the distant sound of someone calling my name. Then, everything went dark. But I was still there. Somehow I was still there. That was when I realized something terrible had happened. The silence was absolute. No voices, no music, no weight of the microphone in my hands. Just a deep emptiness, a feeling of being suspended in a place I couldn't understand. My consciousness awakened slowly. First came the strangeness, the discomfort of not feeling my body as before. There was no weight, no pain, not even the need to breathe. Then came the realization. I was still in the church, but something was wrong. I looked around and saw the same chairs, the same walls, the same lights, but everything seemed different, as if I were seeing my own reality through a foggy glass. And then I saw it. A body lay on the ground, surrounded by desperate people. It took me a second to understand it was me. A deep shock ran through my mind. My body was there, motionless, while some deacons tried to wake me and others shouted for help. A woman knelt beside me, holding my hand, her eyes filled with tears. It was my daughter. I wanted to speak to her, to hold her hand in return, but nothing happened. That was when the panic started. I tried to move, to scream, to force my body to react, but there was no connection. It was as if I were trapped in a formless existence, an invisible presence watching everything without being able to interfere. Something inside me told me that this wasn't normal, that this wasn't just a fainting spell. And then, everything started to change. The surroundings distorted, the lights grew weaker, and the sounds blended into a disturbing hum. The voices of the people disappeared, and the church I knew dissolved into darkness. The ground vanished. I felt as if I were being pulled into something. The wind blew around me, but it wasn't normal wind. It was dense, heavy, carrying something I couldn't explain. An intense cold surrounded me, or what was left of me. The emptiness expanded, and then the whispers came. At first, they were barely perceptible, but soon they grew closer, more insistent. They called my name. Distant voices, some familiar, others completely unknown. Some wept, others laughed in a twisted way, devoid of any real joy. Terror consumed me. I didn't know where I was, but something inside told me this was not heaven. I tried to move again, but it was useless. It was as if I were trapped in an invisible place, surrounded by a darkness that seemed alive. That was when I realized I wasn't alone. Something was watching me, something that didn't want me to leave. The cold intensified. The shadows began to move as if they had a will of their own. The voices grew louder. Some laughed, others whispered words that made no sense. But among the murmurs, one phrase stood out, clear as thunder in my mind. "You preached about God, but you never knew him." A deep chill ran through my soul. What did that mean? I had always dedicated myself to the church, always preached his word, always led my congregation. How could I not have known God? The feeling of being watched grew stronger. The shadows came closer. One of them stood out from the rest. It had no form, no face, but it was real, a suffocating, overwhelming presence. "You spoke of him, but he never knew you." Fear overtook me. I wanted to deny it, to scream that it was a lie, that I had always done what I thought was right. But deep down, an unsettling truth began to surface. What if everything I had lived wasn't enough? What if my pride, my vanity, my need to be respected and admired had blinded me to something much greater? The shadow moved closer, and I tried to step back, but there was nowhere to go. Then I realized it wasn't the shadow moving, it was me. I was being pulled into the void. An invisible force began dragging me, and my terror turned into absolute desperation. I tried to grasp onto something, but my hands passed through empty air. I tried to pray, but no sound came from my lips. The shadows twisted around me, whispering words that burned into my mind. "You spoke of a God you never knew. You made disciples for yourself, not for him. You used his name, but you never loved him." The horror consumed me because, deep down, I knew there was truth in those words. For years, my faith had become a facade, a position, a status. And now, I stood before something I did not understand, something that could consume me forever, something that had already begun pulling me away. Then, in the most terrifying moment, when all seemed lost, a light emerged among the shadows. It was small but intense, and for the first time since this nightmare began, the darkness retreated. Time seemed to vanish in that place. I felt the light surrounding me, but it wasn't like any light I had ever known. It didn't come from a distant sun or artificial lamps. It simply was. It filled everything, as if every particle of space was saturated with a force greater than anything I had ever experienced. Then he spoke. "Margaret, you speak of me, but you have never known me." The words resounded within me like thunder. They were not merely heard. They pierced my soul, tearing apart every excuse I had ever made, shattering every argument I might have tried to form. I opened my mouth to respond but realized there was nothing I could say. The truth stood before me, undeniable and inescapable. Something inside me broke. A part of myself that I had carried for years dissolved in that moment. It was my pride, the absolute certainty that I was a righteous woman, a faithful servant, an unquestionable spiritual leader. It all crumbled because now, before him, I saw myself as I truly was. And what I saw was terrifying. Around me, like projections in the air, scenes from my life began to take form. At first, they were small moments, fragments of the past that seemed insignificant. But with each new image, the weight of the truth grew heavier. I saw myself standing before a mirror, adjusting my clothes before stepping onto the pulpit. That day, I wasn't concerned with God's presence. I was concerned with the impression I would make. I saw myself refusing to help a humble woman who had come to the church seeking aid because it wasn't the right moment. I saw myself counting offerings, worrying about numbers, strategizing for growth, without once thinking about whether those souls were truly being saved. I saw myself preaching about repentance without ever having repented. Then the scene changed. Now I stood before a young man. He held a Bible in his hands, his eyes shining with a genuine desire to serve. I recognized this moment. He had come to me years ago, heart ablaze for God, eager to understand the Bible, to learn about his calling, to be useful in the kingdom. I remembered what I had told him. This is not for just anyone. You need to have a solid ministry, to build credibility before you think about something great. God honors preparation. At the time, my words had seemed wise. But now, watching the scene unfold from the outside, I saw something different. I saw the light in his eyes fade. I saw insecurity grow within him. I saw how my words had not encouraged him but pushed him away from the faith he had. I saw that young man drift away from the church, and now I knew. He never returned. A sharp pain pierced my chest. It wasn't physical, but something far worse. Because in that instant, I understood something I had never considered. My words carried weight, not just the weight of influence but the weight of spiritual responsibility. I had not only led people, I had driven some away from God. The images continued. I saw every time I had taught human rules as if they were divine commandments. I saw the people who had been lost, unable to follow standards that I had created. Then, I saw something that made me collapse. I saw Jesus. He was standing at the altar, watching me preach. But he was not smiling. He was not applauding. His eyes were filled with sorrow. And in that instant, I realized what I had never understood. I preached about God, but not for God. I didn't speak to him, only about him. My faith wasn't a relationship. It was a system. And in that moment, I felt like the smallest of all creatures. The weight of the revelation was crushing. I fell to my knees, unable to sustain my own existence before him. My eyes filled with tears. I wanted to beg for forgiveness, to say that I hadn't known, that I had never realized. But I knew that was a lie. Deep down, throughout all those years, I had felt something was wrong. I had felt the emptiness in my heart. I had felt his absence at the altar. But I ignored it, because it was easier to keep going. It was easier to pretend everything was fine. And now, standing before Christ himself, I could no longer run from the truth. And so, in the absolute silence, I managed to whisper just one phrase. "Is there still time for me?" The light around me pulsed. I didn't know the answer. But for the first time, I was truly asking. I didn't know what to expect. If I still had a heart, if that was even possible, it was pounding, not because I was alive, but because something inside me feared the answer. The moments stretched into eternity. Then the light intensified. The ground beneath my knees vanished. I felt as if I were being lifted, as if something was pulling me upward. But not in a terrifying way. It was a calling. And then he spoke. "Margaret, I never knew you." The words sliced through me like sharp blades. I felt each syllable cut deep, every letter penetrate my soul. I had never been a stranger to the world. My name had been spoken from pulpits, on radio and television, at conferences. People trusted my words, sought my counsel. But to him, I was no one. Not because he didn't love me, but because I had never truly sought him. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. How could I argue before him? How could I justify years of empty teachings, of mechanical prayers, of a ministry that carried my name but had never carried his presence? I wanted to say that I had done everything for him. But now I finally saw the truth. I had done everything for myself. And for the first time, I was completely stripped of everything I had ever believed myself to be. The pulpit, the lights, the respect, the admiration, the titles. None of it mattered now. What mattered was something I had never had. A relationship. True love. Real surrender. I felt hot tears stream down my face. My body trembled, not from cold, but from a crushing weight, as if my soul itself were being torn apart from within. Jesus stepped closer. His presence was so overwhelming that I felt every part of me being consumed by that light. Then he raised his hand, and in an instant, everything changed. I was no longer there. Suddenly, I was back inside my church, but it wasn't the church I knew. There was no music, no people smiling or lifting their hands in worship. The air was heavy, suffocating, as if something unseen had drained all life from the place. Then I saw them. Dark stains spread across the walls, pulsing like open wounds. The once grand pulpit was now decayed, crumbling as if time had eaten away at its foundation. My throat tightened. I turned at the sound of whispers and saw them. Faces I knew. Members of my congregation. But their eyes, they were empty, lifeless, like hollow shells of the people I once led. They weren't just lost. They were abandoned. I heard distant voices. I turned and saw a man walking away from the church, carrying an invisible burden, so heavy it made his steps slow, almost painful. A woman stood outside, tears streaming down her face, pleading for something she never found within these walls. A young man sat alone, staring at nothing, the same young man who once came to me full of fire, desperate to know more about God. I had told him he wasn't ready, that he needed to build credibility before he could step into his calling. I thought I was giving him wisdom, but now, watching from the outside, I saw it for what it was. I had killed his faith. They weren't just leaving the church. They were walking away from God. And in that moment, I understood. It wasn't just sermons I preached. They were sentences. It wasn't just rules I enforced. They were chains. I felt the ground beneath me vanish. I wanted to scream, to run after them, to tell them that it was all wrong. That God was never about rules, appearances, or control. That he was always about grace, truth, and real love. But it was too late. The vision dissolved like dust in the wind. And once again, I was standing before him. But this time, I couldn't lift my eyes to his. Shame weighed me down until I collapsed, my face to the ground. I had always seen myself as a great pastor, but in that moment, I felt smaller than nothing. Silence surrounded me until his voice broke through. There is still time. The breath I didn't realize I was holding escaped my lungs. The answer I had feared came like an unexpected relief. But before I could grasp what it meant, everything around me shifted. The light grew brighter, the ground disappeared, and I was falling. Then, pain. A crushing force slammed into my chest, like I had been hurled back into existence. My lungs burned, my body trembled, and then my eyes flew open, and the blinding light of the hospital ceiling made me wince. The beeping of monitors, the distant sound of voices, it all felt muffled, like I was underwater. Someone gasped. A voice shouted, "She's back." Doctors and nurses surrounded me, their faces blurred, their hands checking my pulse, my vitals. But none of it mattered, because I remembered everything. I had been before him. I had seen the truth. And now I was back, which meant there was still time. My breathing slowed, my body steadied, but my mind was chaos. What was I supposed to do now? I had survived something no one would believe. How could I even begin to explain it? Who would listen? Fear crept in. Maybe it was better to stay silent. Maybe it was safer to pretend nothing had happened. But deep down, I knew that wasn't an option. Then I felt it. A chill ran down my spine. That same presence. But it wasn't God. The air thickened, pressing down on me like an invisible weight. My heart pounded as I turned my head, slowly, afraid of what I already knew was there. A shadow stood in the corner of the room watching. The voices started again that night. At first, just whispers in the dark, faint and distant. But then louder. Clearer. Words twisted and distorted, creeping into my mind like poison. I recognized those voices. The same ones from the darkness. The same ones that had tried to pull me into the void. They were back. And they spoke only one thing. If you speak, you will lose everything. I gasped awake, my breath shallow, my skin clammy. The hospital room was dark, the only light coming from the soft glow of the monitors. But the air, it was heavy, too heavy. Then the weight pressed down on my chest. Hard. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The temperature in the room dropped, and the shadow in the corner shifted. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The pressure increased. The whispers grew into a deafening chorus. Stay silent. Forget it all. Panic clawed at my mind. I was suffocating, drowning in an unseen force. And then, something inside me broke. Not with my voice, but with my soul. I cried out, "Jesus!" The shadow recoiled. The weight vanished. Silence fell over the room, thick and absolute. My body shot upright, lungs gasping for air. My hands trembled. My heart pounded. But I knew one thing with certainty. They didn't want me to speak, which meant I had to. I left the hospital days later, but I didn't leave the battle. Every step outside that building felt like stepping into a war I couldn't see. The wind felt colder, the sun less warm, the world unchanged. But I wasn't the same. Since the day I came back, I've felt it. That presence. Watching. Waiting. Hoping I'll break. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. But I knew better. The nights were the worst. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back there, before him, before the truth that tore my soul apart. And, most of all, before his words. There is still time. But what did that mean? What did he want me to do? The answer came days later, in the most unexpected way. I was sitting alone in my house, staring at the Bible on my table. I had held that same Bible in my hands for years, preached from it, taught its words. But for the first time in my life, I realized I had never truly understood it. The phone rang. I hesitated before answering. It was a pastor friend, someone who had admired me for years, who had followed my ministry closely. "I heard what happened," he said. "People are talking." I didn't say a word. "Some say you saw God. Others say it was just a hallucination. I need to know the truth. What really happened?" I closed my eyes. My heart tightened. This was it. If I told the truth, I knew what would happen. I would be questioned, ridiculed. I'd lose my influence, my name, my position. If I stayed silent, everything would go back to normal. I could continue my life as before, but I would never be the same. I took a deep breath. "I died," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "And Jesus showed me something I never wanted to see." Silence on the other end. Then a deep breath. "What did he show you?" A shiver ran down my spine. There was no turning back now. So I told him everything. I didn't hold anything back. I spoke about the empty church, about the lifeless eyes of people who had followed my voice but never truly found God. I told him about the sins no one could see, the ones hidden from men but fully exposed before him. I spoke about the fear, the despair of realizing I had spent years preaching about someone I had never truly known. When I finished, there was only silence. I braced myself, expecting laughter, skepticism, maybe even pity. But then, I heard something that stopped my heart. He was crying. "I knew something was wrong," he whispered, his voice breaking. I always felt like something was missing, but I never had the courage to admit it. A tear slipped down my cheek. "Then you still have time," I whispered. That night, I understood my mission. I couldn't keep living the same way. I couldn't go back. I had to tell people what I saw. I had to warn those who, like me, believed they were on the right path but were actually far from the truth. I knew many wouldn't believe me. I knew I would face resistance, doubt, rejection. But none of that mattered anymore. Because now I truly knew God. And for the first time in my life, I was free. There's still time to choose him. There's still time to change your story. Because in the end, titles, positions, recognition, none of it means anything. In the end, there's only one question that truly matters. Do you really know God? Let's remember the words in Matthew chapter 7, verses 21 to 23. "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons and perform many miracles?' Then I will tell them plainly, 'I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers.'" If my story resonated with you, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to NDE Chronicles for more inspiring near-death experiences. It helps reach those who need to hear it. Thanks for watching.